Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to another week of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is a Monday. It is the 22nd day of August in the year 2016, and it is absolutely gorgeous here. After all the heat and humidity and rain we've had, it is absolutely delightful to wake up this morning to 58-degree temperatures and a promise that the clouds would lift and the sky would turn blue and the sun would come out, and all that has come to pass. And it is the most beautiful, cool, comfortable day here in Appalachia. And I know this is pretty much the whole region. The cold front from the came down from the north, the northern western Canada, and we knew it was coming. But oh my heavens, does it feel wonderful! So everything that just kind of makes everything look a little bit better and feel a little bit better and all that. But I want to thank you for tuning in to yet the beginning of another week here at the Virtual Center. I do appreciate, as I always try to make a point to say, your continued support for this program and for the Head On Radio Network. And I think as we continue to fumble our way toward a November 8th deadline to select a new president, and I use the word fumble advisedly. Advisingly, where did I get that one? Advisedly. I want you to, keep in mind that we really do appreciate your continued support. And I think at this time, perhaps more than any other, it's important to keep programs like the ones you hear on the Head On Radio Network on the air. So again, I thank you for your continued support of the network, for your continued regular support for this program. I want you to know how much it's appreciated. And in fact, one of the items that I'd like to begin with our program early in our program today is an item that I did receive from one of our listeners, Gene, and I want to thank him for alerting me on this particular issue. It's an old issue. The issue of an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. It seems to me we took that one about as far as it could go several months ago. In fact, Bob Kincaid was kind enough to drop me a note this weekend and make the point when he saw that article that looks like the nation is finally beginning to wake up to the danger of an Article 5 convention. And he was making the point that we were on that so long ago. We were pretty much out ahead of that baby. But that doesn't deny the fact as to how serious it is and how close it's becoming. So I want to share a little bit of that with you today as one of our items. So I guess we could say that this Monday looks like it's going to be another one of those this, that, and the other as we try to make up for the time that has lapsed between our last day together, which was last Wednesday, and today. And of course, we had a weekend in between and all the events surrounding that. So I do welcome you to this new week of programming, and I thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center. We do look forward to hearing from you. And should you like to get on the air and share your thoughts, your concerns, your questions, your comments with our other listeners, we have a number available just for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you would like to share your thoughts, but at the same time not do it on the air, then I invite you to put it in an email and send it to me directly. I would love to hear from you, and I will do my best to acknowledge receipt of your email. I didn't email Gene back on his because I knew that I was going to make mention of this on today's program, and I thought that I would use the opportunity of today's program to thank him for keeping the virtual center in mind. I do appreciate it. This is Gene is very good at sending links to a number of important issues, and over the months and years he's done that. This particular one I jumped on and want to share with you. So I do thank Gene for that. And I do remind you of our Facebook page. We do have a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. And if you are a regular user of Facebook, it's very easy to get into our page. Just go to the homepage of Facebook, and in the search box that you see at the top of the page, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. And this past weekend, I posted 3 or 4 items on the Facebook page, most of them links to particular articles, and most of them, very honestly, related to the topic we were discussing at the end of our programming last week, which was the appointment of a new team to head up Donald Trump's election campaign, Stephen Bannon from Breitbart News, and a new campaign manager, Kelly Ann Conway, and what the implications of that particular change seem to be. And since our last program on Wednesday, there have been a number of people addressing that particular topic. And once again, to be honest with you, I felt a little bit encouraged by the fact that as I, read these different op-ed pieces and points of view over the last 3 or 4 days, while I picked up a lot of information which I'd like to take today the opportunity, a portion of today's program, and share with you. The fact of the matter is we were pretty much on target, it looks like. Much of what has surfaced in the 3 or 4 days since we were last together pretty well reinforces what we were doing even before we knew for sure that we were right. We were speculating based on some of the evidence we have and making what I guess we used to call educated guesses. But turns out that much of what we were speculating is indeed the substance of much that's being written on this particular topic. So I think I think we're in good shape as far as that topic is concerned. But I mentioned, in what I like to call this, that, and the other Monday, because it does give us a chance to catch up. There are 2 or 3 separate items that I picked up on over the last 3 or 4 days that I wanted to make a point, at least to call to your attention, because I think they are worthy of your attention. The first one is indeed the article from Gene on the link to an article by Simon Davis Cohen on the question of a constitutional convention. What we see Simon Davis Cohen writing about is the fact that the magic percentage of 2/3 of the states necessary to call a constitutional convention is getting very, very close. With West Virginia's passage in March, during its session, toward the end of its session in March, actually the 12th day, I think the session ended on the 15th of March or the 17th of March or something like that. This particular legislation passed on the 12th day of March, and West Virginia became the 28th state to request a constitutional convention for purposes of considering a balanced budget amendment. And it's a little bit complicated, and I don't want to necessarily take a huge portion of a program to go back through all of this today, but on the other hand, I think it's important to at least be aware of what's going on. We talked, when we dealt with this topic before, we dealt with the fact that there's some question, and let me preface this by saying that we don't have any precedents to go by. There's no history here. Because an Article 5 convention has never been called since the one that developed and ratified, passed the Constitution of the United States, submitted it to Congress, and then Congress submitted it to the states for ratification, and it was ratified by the requisite number of states, which was 9 at that time, 9 out of the 13, and became the law of the land. That's the only called convention that we've ever had. This would be the first since then, or the second, if you will. And since it's never happened before, then we are kind of, up a creek, so to speak, in terms of looking for precedents. When people ask questions, there's no way to know. One of the things we talked about, for example, was whether in fact the resolutions calling for such an amendment had to be exactly the same. There are scholars who have argued that if there's any difference in the wording of the resolutions from state to state, then you could make a challenge to the fact that 2/3 of the states have actually requested such a convention. With that in mind, then, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the ALEC group, which is funded by a number of corporations, the most prominent one being Koch Industries, ALEC put its resources to this question and began to develop a series of model resolutions and used ALEC's resources throughout the country to enter them into state legislative business in a number of states, so that if they ultimately passed, it was very likely that the resolutions would be the same. And in fact, ALEC even created a mechanism to kind of keep track, kind of a check mark system to count the number of responses so that they would know when they're getting close. And the fact of the matter is they are getting close. And this particular article by Mr. Simon Cohen makes the point that West Virginia, when it approved the call for such a convention on March 12th, became the 28th state. That leaves 6 that are necessary to reach the magic 2/3. And according to the author of this piece, the target is, the target was the 4th of July. The assumption was that the 4th of July would be a day to hit the target. So now, whether in fact that meant the 4th of July that just passed a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, or whether they're talking about the next 4th of July, I'm not really sure. But theoretically, they had a target because they are close. And in fact, the legislation is on the docket in a number of state legislatures and will be introduced this fall. So the thinking is that by the time we get into next year, we are likely to be very, very close to the calling of such a convention. To make this even more complicated, however, it's important to mention that there are 2 different issues operating simultaneously here. One is the call for the convention to consider the balanced budget amendment, but another one is a project called a convention of states, which would require the same 2/3, the same for 34 states. The only difference is that the purpose or the call for the Convention of States would be much more flexible and open than the specific call for a balanced budget amendment. Specifically, the whole motive behind the Convention of States issue is not only a balanced budget amendment, but also to, quote, curtail the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, unquote. So the implication here is that if the Convention of States project is successful, then the convening of an Article 5 convention would not be limited to just the balanced budget amendment, but to other amendments, all of which would fall under the heading of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And the fact of the matter is, some people believe that in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 amendments would fall under this category. And that brings us back to the Liberty Amendments, the book that we looked at a year or two ago on the proposal for various amendments that were all geared towards limiting the power of the federal government. So it's a little bit complicated. Here in West Virginia, just for your information, here in West Virginia, both of those passed at different levels. Specifically, the House of Delegates approved the resolution calling for the Article 5 convention to consider the balanced budget amendment. But in the Senate, they approved the Convention of States idea. The Senate approved a much more flexible, wider amendment on limiting the powers and jurisdiction of the federal government by giving the convention latitude to pass more amendments than just the balanced budget amendment. It passed the Senate here in West Virginia by one vote on a straight party vote of 17 to 16. And, not to rewrite history here, but you may recall that some months ago when we were talking about the process whereby West Virginia went from being a blue state to a red state, we looked at the way that the Republicans were here in this state were able to get control of the Senate. The election 2 years ago was a draw. And what that means is there were an equal number of Democrats and Republicans elected. And one of the Democratic candidate electees, his name is Daniel Hall from an adjoining county here in southern West Virginia, switched his party affiliation at the last minute, which gave the Republicans the majority they needed in the Senate. And they've been going on the basis of that majority ever since. And that's really the election that is up this coming fall, for which I have chosen to run. Because it seems to me that this is one of the issues that I would like to be in the legislature to deal with when it comes up. This is one of the issues, and I believe on a straight party vote, I really don't believe the news accounts suggest that there was some discussion about the issue and the severity of this and the fear of a runaway convention and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, I'm really concerned. And if we can successfully overturn the majority that's in our legislature right now, I think West Virginia could make a move to rescind its call for an Article 5 convention, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share this with you today, because this makes pretty good sense. There is a move. This also stems from ALEC. There is a move to try to shortcut and make more likely the ratification of what such a convention would do by passing a compact arrangement whereby the states assembled in such a convention would approve the amendment and ratify it at the same time, rather than approve it and then have to wait to get the 3/4 of the states' votes they would need. So basically what we're looking at is we would need 34 states to propose the amendment, 38 states to ratify it. The American Legislative Exchange Council is obviously fairly confident of its ability to get more than the minimum of 34 states. They believe that they can be successful because of the number of states in which Republicans control both houses of the legislature, plus the governor's office. ALEC believes that it's entirely likely that they could get well over the 34 states, which would be required, which would mean that they could collapse the ratification procedure to the point that passage and ratification of an amendment or a series of amendments could all happen at the same time. Basically, then, what we are looking for here is, or what we're looking at is the prospect of a revolution, if this indeed happens. At minimum, the approval of a balanced budget amendment would pretty well tie the nation to supply side economics forever, for the foreseeable future. It would, at a minimum, it would deny the federal government the option of using its taxing powers and using deficit spending to address recessions. You'll remember the emergence of the TARP program and the bailouts that accompanied the recession of 07 and 08 that the Obama administration was able to work through the system in order to short circuit the severity of the recession, which was very serious. But as is becoming clear right now, it appears that President Obama was able to stem the threat of a catastrophe in this country with in the recession of 07-08. That option of bailouts and a TARP program would be gone under a balanced budget amendment. And so, at a very minimum, if an Article 5 convention is called for the balanced budget amendment, that's going to be the outcome. But likely, it's going to be much more than that. So I do believe, as I think we've talked about when we covered this topic so thoroughly before, I do believe that this particular issue is one that we are going to have to keep an eye on because it's getting very close. And there are a number of states, I think there's about 9 or 10 states that are ready to receive the resolution, proposed resolution for calling this convention. All they need is 34 to call the convention. And if they get 38, then in theory they could pass amendments and ratify them at one sitting. And that would really take the issue out of the hands of the American people. In other words, it would happen before the people really had a chance to know for sure what was really happening. So that issue is one that I just wanted to call your attention to. And I want to thank Gene for sending us this article by Mr. Cohen. Simon Cohen, who's raising this particular issue. I think the nation is becoming aware of the severity of this particular issue as it gets closer and closer. And you'll recall that the wording of the Constitution, Article 5, does not give Congress the option of not calling a convention. The wording of Article 5 says when 2/3 of the states request such a convention, Congress shall convene it. So there's no option there at all. So I think it's something that all of us will really need to pay attention to. I might say, just as an aside, and this is information in this particular article, that not only has Ted Cruz signed on to this constitutional convention idea, but so also have Marco Rubio, John Kasich, so a number of prominent leaders, prominent Republicans in this country have signed on to this idea of the balanced budget amendment. So, and here in West Virginia, it passed the particular bill that passed, House Bill 2424, was and the only way it passed was that the Senate backed down on the more general proposal that it passed by one vote and ratified the House Bill 2424, and that meant that West Virginia was in the approval column for the resolution. So, anyway, that's that particular issue, and I just kind of want to thank Gene for sending us the lead to that, the link to that particular item. Last week, actually on the 19th day of August, which was about 3-4 days ago, there was an article, I believe it was in the Washington Post, on the very cumbersome and convoluted issue of college tuition. And we know that one of the major issues that President Obama and Bernie Sanders' campaign really pushed was the idea of limiting the level of student debt that students are graduating from college with as tuitions continue to go up and up and up. And the second thing, and probably the more prominent piece of that, is the idea of free tuition. And you probably noted, as I did, that the Clinton people bought into this proposal pretty much, and it became part of the Democratic platform that was approved at the Philadelphia Convention in July. I think it was July, yeah. And this particular article was written by a political scientist, a political theorist at Harvard, whose name is Danielle Allen. And Danielle Allen was at Princeton University. Apparently she was also at Amherst College, but I can remember reading some of her material. I think she wrote on the Declaration of Independence, as I recall, in a book that came out last year. But she's now a political theorist at Harvard. She wrote a piece on the very complicated issue of setting college tuitions. I have a very, very good friend and colleague that I worked with when I was working in higher education, who worked in the admissions office at our university, at Concord University here in southern West Virginia. And he's a pretty knowledgeable guy in the area of college tuitions because he was out recruiting students. And he used to go out and talk about financial aid and eligibility for financial aid and all the rest of it. So any questions that I have about the admissions process or the tuition financial aid process, I usually run by him. I forwarded a copy of this article by Danielle Allen to him because I wanted to get his spin on it. I found it extremely confusing, but at the same time, worth trying to figure out because it's extremely substantive and I believe important. This issue is becoming very important in this nation, it seems to me, because college tuitions have gone so high that once again it appears that a college education is rapidly falling under the within the reach of only the well-to-do. The fact of the matter is, financial aid packages don't nearly begin to cover the costs of tuition anymore. I can remember when I came here some years ago, I can remember writing ads for the local newspapers when we were recruiting students for the beginning of another college year. I can remember putting in ads the fact that we were proud as an institution to be able to tell students that if they were on full financial aid, full Pell Grants, their Pell Grant would fully cover the cost of tuition at our institution. And I can remember for part-time students, a 3-credit course was $299. In other words, $100 effectively, $100 per credit hour. And so basically what that meant was that if you registered as a full-time student for 12 credits, your tuition was about $1,200, or maybe a couple of dollars less than that. And this was in the late 90s, and this was something to brag about, because private institutions especially, and some public institutions as well, had reached the point where financial aid packages that most students qualified for didn't cover the cost of tuition. And when you add books and room and board and all the rest of it, the fact of the matter is students were being put in the position of having to borrow money to supplement their financial aid. And that was the beginning of the trend, which has seen over the last 15 years or so, which has seen tuition costs continue to go up and up and up, which means that students, even if they are under full Pell Grants, are usually required to borrow now a significant amount of money in order to cover the cost of tuition. And if you're looking at a 4-year program, a 4-year degree program, then whatever the difference is between the financial aid package and the tuition costs, whatever the gap is that requires the loan, then you have to multiply that by at least 4. Most students, it takes them 5 years or sometimes 6 years to qualify to graduate. So if you take that gap, which is getting larger and larger every year, and then you multiply it by 4 or 5 years, knowing that during the intervening years, tuition is probably going to go up another 7 or 8%, which it has been doing. The fact of the matter is you can begin to understand how it came to be that so many students graduate with absolutely huge college debt. It's a real problem. And during the George W. Bush years, during the first 8 years of this new century, the 21st century, the Bush administration was able to move through Congress legislation which got the federal government out of the student loan business and turned it over to private lenders. And by that, of course, what we mean is it becomes a for-profit operation, the loaning of money. And what that meant was that the interest rates on the amount of money that students were borrowing went up significantly. And all that did was increase the size of their debt. Well, under the Obama administration, the federal government has gotten back into the loan business, has driven the private sector out because the costs of borrowing this money became prohibitively high. And now the federal government is involved in these loans, and the result was that the interest rates are lower for students. But that benefit has oftentimes been offset by the fact that tuition costs have continued to escalate. All of that is background to this particular article by Danielle Allen. Basically, of course, her background is Amherst College, Princeton University, and Harvard University. She's talking about the better schools, the elite schools, so to speak. High-cost, private liberal arts colleges. So that's what she's talking about. And the tuitions in those institutions is huge. Let me give you a couple of examples from her article. She said that in 2014-2015 at Amherst College, tuition was about $65,000. At other institutions, it was in the same neighborhood, 70,000, something like that, depending on the institution. But this is her point. Tuition really doesn't cover the cost of instruction. Her point is that tuition never covers the cost of instruction. That means that there's always the reality of students being subsidized. The level of tuition determines how much. And basically, this is what makes it so confusing. Her point, her theme here, is that the idea of tuition, of a certain set dollar figure for the costs of student attendance, ought to be abolished. Because the fact of the matter is, it's bogus. It doesn't really measure anything. Because the reality is that the tuition figure, the so-called sticker price, never meets the actual cost of instruction. For example, she says that in 2014-2015, while the tuition sticker price was $65,000, the actual cost of tuition per student was $95,600. At Princeton, she said, same year, the cost of actual instruction was $92,000 per student. And in others, the Ivy League schools, for example, and some of the more, high-level private liberal arts colleges, the cost of instruction was around $100,000 in most of them. Stanford, Harvard, Brown, Yale, etc. So her point was that the cost of instruction was never even approached by the dollar figure, the so-called sticker price, the tuition that everybody used. But the fact of the matter is, what she points out is that the only people who pay tuition are people from other states or out of the country or whatever. That the fact of the matter is, all colleges and universities subsidize tuition rates. The issue is how much. And her point is the higher the tuition figure, the sticker price, the less subsidies there are to make up the difference. Her point was then that we ought not to be opposed to seeing tuition rates go up, because the further they go up, the less subsidizing of students, institutions, and the federal government in its financial aid programs needs to do. The higher the tuition number is, the closer it is to the actual cost of educating a student. So the fact of the matter is, with tuition being low, that means that there's much more subsidy necessary in order to pay for the instruction of a student. It's just the opposite of what we would think. We would think that lowering the cost of tuition was a good thing. Her argument is it's not. It's a bad thing. And her point is the institutions would be better off if they stopped setting tuition rates at all and began to ask the serious questions that really are involved. And this is what her questions are. These are the questions, she said, that would much more accurately give citizens accurate information on what's going on. She says that instead of tuition rates, colleges should instead publish 5 numbers, she said. First, number 1, how much colleges spend each year on educating each student. The average cost of instruction. That's the 92,000. That's the 92.6 number that I mentioned earlier. The 92,000, or the 95.6 for Amherst College, or the 92,000 for Princeton. That number, Danielle Allen says, is much more meaningful. So her point is every institution ought to make public that number. That's the first number that ought to be publicized. Second, the range a family is expected to contribute to that expense. In other words, if the actual cost of tuition is $100,000, then the next question is, how much of that $100,000 can a particular family afford to pay? And obviously, wealthier families would be able to pay more of it than poorer families. Third question. How much a family contributes on average at our college? On average, how much of the $100,000, that's the actual cost of instruction, do most families pay? And then the next question, what is the range of what the college itself will contribute for each student? In other words, if the target is $100,000 for the cost of instruction, how much of that can the average family afford to pay for? Let's say that of that the average family pays $18,000. That means that there's a difference of $82,000. So the next question is, how much of that $82,000 can the college afford to contribute to the education of this particular student? And then the last number that colleges need to publish, she says, how much does the college contribute on average to the total expense of each student? How much subsidy does this college give the average student? Cost of instruction here is $100,000. The average contribution of families is $18,000. That leaves a balance of 82. Of that 82, what's the average that this college is willing to put up to subsidize the instruction of each child, of each kid? Her point is, if parents knew that number, then they could make a better choice as to what they could afford, what they couldn't afford, where the child should go, where they shouldn't go, etc. Now, the next question, of course, then, is once you get all of those questions answered, then you look at the balance that's left. And then the question is, how much of that can the government afford to subsidize, or how much of that can we put into a loan package? Her feeling, her argument is this is a much more honest, accurate way than just putting out a figure like $65,000 because for tuition, because her point is that it's bogus. Because the real cost, the real issue is how much does it cost to educate a student. So if that doesn't confuse the issue, and she even says at the end of her article, if you feel confused by now, you've just experienced a small taste of what conversations about tuition setting are like in higher education. This is what we discuss in meetings all the time, is how to set these figures. And these are the factors that go into setting tuition rates and other things. The reason I introduced this particular piece here at the Virtual Center is because this particular issue plays a critical role in the civic responsibility aspects of what this program is about. There's absolutely no question that the willingness of a society to subsidize the education of its young people, the college education of its young people, is based on an assumption that the entire society will benefit from this expenditure. The reason that governments are willing to use taxpayer money to subsidize the education of young people is because society has made a decision that the education of as many of its people as possible will contribute to the quality of life of all of its people. That particular decision, that particular assumption that that is true, is clearly what's under attack today. Books are coming out raising the question as to whether college has become so expensive that it's even worth it anymore. Other books and articles come out pointing out that so many of the kids, of young people, I keep saying kids, so many students who come out of our colleges can't do anything. They don't have the skills. They don't have the work experiences. They don't have the wherewithal and the vision to make a meaningful contribution to anybody, to any employer. So the question then is, what good is the money being spent for their college education? So with many people from different directions questioning the value of college, the value of a college education in today's world, then I think Daniel Allen's article is timely and important, because I think more and more of us are going to begin to look seriously at this question the further on we go. If you take the Bernie Sanders position about free tuition in public colleges and universities and throw it into this mix, then I think you begin to get a pretty good idea of what the difference is between the Sanders position and the position of an Amherst or a Harvard or a Princeton or a Yale or a Brown or Stanford or one of those others. Obviously, what the institutions that Danielle Allen is writing about are doing is educating the best of the best. We're talking about the education of the elite. It doesn't mean that only the people from the families from elite families get into these institutions. We know that the Yales and Columbias and Harvards and Princetons and all the rest of them every year admit a portion of their student population from families that we wouldn't consider to be affluent. We also know that some of the best colleges and universities in the country have goals on admitting international students. I think I shared with you some time ago a personal story about my wife's son, who is in a master's degree program at Duke University. The maximum enrollment in this MBA program that he was in was 20. And out of the 20 admissions, 12 of them were reserved for out-of-the-nation people. In other words, only 8 admissions would go to U.S. American citizens. The other 12 would go to out of state. The message there, it seems to be clear. Duke University has made the decision that its graduates in this program will have a worldwide vision, a worldwide familiarity, and worldwide contacts. The thinking is that the people who go through this program will become the financial and management business leaders all over the world. And the fact of the matter is, the contacts that they make in this program at Duke University will be with them all into the future. These people will remain close contacts, confidants, and colleagues once they get into business. So the idea is that this program is envisioned as a vital part of a global economic system. And this program enlists the leaders of that program. That's the goal, that's the plan, and that's who gets in. So I think we have quite a bit of insight as to really what's going on here. It's pretty obvious then that if everybody is, if Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are able to implement the program they're talking about, what Hillary is saying is free tuition for all students coming from families making less than $100,000 a year. So theoretically, if you come from a family that has a household income of more than $100,000 a year, then you would pay some towards your own education. But less than $100,000, your public college and university education would be free. So the fact of the matter is, how does that stack up against what Danielle Allen is talking about? Namely, what is the relationship between public colleges and universities and private ones? Because the fact of the matter is, and I know a lot of people don't appreciate this, but students attending private institutions get federal financial aid dollars as well as publics. So the federal government is not dictating if you get money from us, you have to go to a public institution because the tuitions are less. And the fact of the matter is, if these privates, the Stanfords, Yales, Harvards, Browns, and the rest of them, if they are allowed to set their rates high, which is what Danielle Allen is talking about, not setting them at all. But if they're going to be high, then that means the gap between the tuition, the money that's coming into the institution, versus the cost of instructing each student, the gap is going to be less. But the reality is, as private institutions raise their tuition to these astronomical figures of $65,000 and $70,000 a year, then what that's done in the past is pretty much create a blank check for public institutions. Because when public institutions, and what we're talking about are state universities and colleges, the West Virginia universities and the Ohio states and the universities of Wisconsin and Missouri and Nebraska and Oklahoma and all the rest of them. These are all public institutions. But the fact of the matter is, if the private institutions are setting tuition rates at very high levels, then public institutions can without a problem raise their tuitions. As long as they remain less than the privates, people are going to say, oh, that's a better deal, it's cheaper. So the reality is, as the privates have raised their tuition, the publics have moved in and raised theirs also. So the fact of the matter is, students can say tuition is going up and up and up, but it's still less than I would pay if I was going to a private college like Amherst or Smith College or one of those. And there's one other factor to be considered here, and then we'll take our break because we're just nearing it. I think it's 57 minutes after the hour, so we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. And I think it's time for a break, and then when we come back, we'll hit a new topic. But the only additional issue I would add is a serious look at the cost of instruction. And what I mean is, there are some serious assumptions built into this idea of the cost of instruction. Because the fact of the matter is, are the factors that go into the total cost of instruction all necessary components of instruction? And what I'm talking about are athletic events, cultural events, concerts, paid speeches of highly paid speakers, plays, musicals, subsidized athletics, counselors, guidance counselors, job counselors, all of the services that comprise a higher education institution. All of those are figured into the total cost of instruction. And the fact of the matter is, they tend to be costs that are never questioned, because they're all internal decisions that higher education over the years has been able to secure the right to do. In other words, nobody tells these institutions how to do their business. They decide that. And what they do at the end of the process is they begin to add up the costs of all the services and all the things that have been added. And that way they come up with the figure of the cost per instruction. And then they basically give that to the student and saying, it costs us $100,000 to educate Johnny. But Johnny never gets a chance to ask, what is that $100,000? What am I buying? The answer would be, that's why you choose this institution, because you trust us to make that decision. So you just have to trust us. And I think maybe that trust is beginning to fall under some scrutiny as well. And maybe, to be honest with you, maybe it should. Maybe it should. Anyway, we are at the top of the hour. It's just exactly 2 p.m. in the East. Almost like I planned it, huh? Anyway, we're going to pause for a break, a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back with our second hour. And there's yet another issue that I'd like to, the two issues that I'd like to deal with the second hour. And, of course, the last one will be on the ongoing saga of the campaign of Donald Trump and what seems to be going on, because I think we really struck a note last week when we began to touch on that topic. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back. So please stay with us. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome. I just sent a quick note, a chat note to Agnes, and talked about how beautiful the weather is today. It's infectious. I'm kind of looking out the window here, and I'm thinking, oh my heavens, what a gorgeous day. I hope that it's going well for you, and I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I particularly want to thank you for staying with us. And if you're just joining us, we dealt with a couple of issues during our first hour. One of them is the setting of college tuitions, and the other one was the fact that we're getting very, very close to the calling of an Article 5 convention to approve a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. West Virginia, in March, when it ratified the call, became the 28th state, and 34 are required. So 6 more will do it, will result in such a convention, and we talked a little bit about that. I want to encourage you to stay in touch with us and to feel comfortable participating in our program in ways other than listening into it. And I know that if the program is challenging, and I trust that I try to work to make sure that it is, but if the program is challenging and if it does indeed provoke thought and questions, then listening to the program is work. And, I understand that. But the fact of the matter is you can participate in other ways as well. And one is to get on the air and actually have your thoughts and ideas aired and give others a chance to react to you and to some of your thoughts and your concerns and your ideas or suggestions or fears or hopes or whatever they might be. Our phone number is there primarily for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate, I would appreciate that. I would love to hear from it, and I will do the very best I can to acknowledge receipt of your email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And then finally, of course, I do encourage you to stay in touch with our Facebook page. This past weekend, the past 3 or 4 days, I've probably posted 5 or 6 different links to stories and articles that I thought would be of interest and were valuable enough to call them to the attention of our listeners. So I hope you agree. And I think, again, we solicit your response to those articles and to the opinions associated with them. I never put a link on there without making some comment about it, because, there is a reason why I think this particular article might be of interest to you. And so you can read my comments, and if you're interested, then by all means look at the link. And if you're not, then so be it. But there are a number of these postings on there. All of them are examples of positions on which we solicit opinions and ideas and reactions. So please avail yourself of the opportunities available to respond or to react to these. At the beginning of the program today, I referred to this as this, that, and the other Monday, and what I was suggesting is there's kind of 3 or 4 issues that I'd kind of like to bring to your attention. I surveyed a number of possibilities and copied off a number of articles with the idea that I would at least bring some of them to your attention. One of the articles that I really thought was worth a comment, at least, here in the Virtual Center, was an article I ran across in a digital publication called truthout.org. I'm sure that some of you have looked at that offering before. It's called Truthout, Truthout, truthout.org. And there's some really provocative articles and research pieces on that site. And I happened to be struck by one that dealt specifically with pipelines, with the issue of natural gas. And I'll be honest with you, one of the reasons that I think it attracted my attention is because of where I am. West Virginia exists as what some people refer to facetiously as a pass-through state for some of these pipelines. The idea is to run pipelines for natural gas to places where they gain access to shipment overseas. Because with the wealth and the store of natural gas in Marcellus Shale, in this area, in western Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and that area of Appalachia, it appears that Appalachia is on the edge of the same kind of development procedure that it experienced 100 years ago with coal. And a lot of people, and I'm one of them, a lot of people have encouraged or are doing everything they can do to make the point that hopefully we won't make the same mistakes with gas that we made with coal. Because the fact of the matter is, coal was developed and then overdeveloped. And ultimately, once coal began to die in this region, use became less and less, these coal towns and whatever were abandoned as the seams were played out. And once the prosperity was gone, there was little alternative for the people living here. And so basically, it's put the state, this region, into a dire particular situation. We are having documentaries now. There was a previewing of a documentary here last Thursday evening on the issue of what do we do after, what's there after coal? What do we do now? Because the area is reeling. And the fact of the matter is, what this piece in Truthout does is bring us up to date a little bit on some of the plans associated with the excavation and marketing of natural gas. And I just wanted to share some of the information with you, because according to this piece, which was written, and let me honestly say, it was written by Jason Schwartz, who's a member of Greenpeace, which is an environmental group. So obviously this is going to be rather negative towards the coal and oil, towards the gas and oil and gas industry. I think we know that going in. So the fact of the matter is the information itself. Is there enough value to the information itself? Mr. Schwartz makes the point that in order to understand exactly what's going on with industry groups like the American Petroleum Institute, this particular article looks at two states, Colorado and Virginia. Two states that have not Republican but Democratic governors. And Schwartz argues that these governors have pretty well sold out to the industry, to the oil and gas industry. John Hickenlooper in Colorado and Terry McAuliffe in Virginia. And they are pushing the natural gas industry hard, to the point that Schwartz says if McAuliffe had his way, his Virginia would soon become home to two gigantic pipelines transporting fracked natural gas across the state, seizing a 900-mile corridor from the Virginians, through the Virginias, potentially doubling his current state's emissions through methane leakage alone. One of the issues associated with natural gas pipelines is leakage. And what leaks is methane. And the fact of the matter is, while natural gas is being touted as a clean alternative to coal, the fact of the matter is methane poses a greater danger to the climate than does carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. One of the concerns that Schwartz points out is that while natural gas is rapidly replacing coal as the source of our nation's electricity, it's being touted as a bridge between fossil fuels and clean energy, wind, solar. The thinking is natural gas is not as dirty as coal, but on the other hand, it's not as clean as what comes next. So it's a bridge between fossil fuels and clean energy. What Schwartz points out is that this is rather false in a sense, because his point out is that once you build the infrastructure for the movement of this gas with this pipeline network, you're going to have such an investment in the infrastructure that it's going to be very difficult to abandon it in favor of wind and solar, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps nuclear. Although after the tsunami in Fukushima in 2010, it's unclear that nuclear is. Many people still say it'll come back, but at this point, anyway, what Schwartz cites is a new report by an organization he calls Oil Change International. And they're looking at the massive network of pipelines across the eastern seaboard. And this particular piece gives us some insight into that network, how expensive it is, how complex it is, and how embedded it is, and how difficult it's going to be to move it. He says this. He said, "Are you sitting down?" Good, because here are the details. There are 19 pipelines currently proposed in the Appalachian Basin alone, from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with dozens more planned. Two gigantic pipelines are at the center of this network, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. North Carolina's Duke Energy is financing the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to distribute gas across the state. Virginia's Dominion Power is a key financier of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Once these are installed, these proposed pipelines will double the capacity to transport gas in the region. Methane leakage is definitely a problem. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide, and it escapes at all points of the life cycle of natural gas. In other words, leakage happens. President Obama has initiated legislation to greatly reduce the leakage. But the fact of the matter is, Schwartz says, the increased consumption of natural gas is going to undo the savings, and thus we will still exceed our climate targets. In other words, it's a good thing that the government is trying to minimize leakage. But the fact of the matter is the kind of growth that is in these plans indicate that there's no way in the world that government's effort to control leakage can possibly offset the increase in production. We're going to be stuck with it, in other words. We're going to be locked in. He said, basically, we are locking in our commitment to this fuel just by installing the infrastructure to deliver it. Gas plans, he says, are global. Production of gas from the Appalachian Basin will increase by 55%. Domestic consumption will increase by 24%. The difference? Exports. Just think about it. With the EU trying to isolate its biggest source of gas, Russia, Japan shutting down all of its nuclear facilities after Fukushima, China and India expanding gas burning plants and fleets of compressed natural gas vehicles, exporting liquefied natural gas is going to be huge business. And all of this we need to know. Because the fact of the matter is, we're making such an investment in the infrastructure to deliver natural gas that there's no way in the world that that investment can be transferred into clean energy. In a sense, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're taking money that could be used as investment in clean energy, and we're putting it in natural gas instead, even though we admit that natural gas is merely a stopping point midway between the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And the concern of this report is that once you make this kind of a financial investment, there's no way in the world that you can back out of it and abandon it for something else. You've got too much invested in it. And the fact of the matter is, if our consumption of natural gas is going to be up 24%, and the production of natural gas as a result of this pipeline networks is going to be 55%, then the difference is profit in export. And a lot of people are going to get into this. There's no way in the world. What obviously the purpose of this article is about is warning us against the danger of inhibiting permanently our investment in clean energy in favor of this stopgap measure, which is natural gas. And of course, all of this is going to be part of the pipeline network that delivers it all to the Atlantic coast through North Carolina and Virginia. They're going to be the beneficiaries. We have here in southern West Virginia a very significant citizens movement trying to stop the construction of these pipelines. But I'll be very honest with you, it's becoming quite obvious that the power of the people that want them is overwhelming the concerns of the people who don't. And I think governments, especially governments like this one in West Virginia, for example, where the economy is hurting, people are reeling. The promise of tax subsidies from these pipelines alone is going to cause people to hold their nose while they sign on. We've had the experience of coal. I think we're probably going to be in for a similar one in the area of natural gas and fracking. But anyway, I just thought that that particular perspective, that particular piece was one that all of you, all of our listeners should know about, because I think it's very significant. And the fourth issue that I'd like to deal with today, and we're moving towards the bottom of the hour, we're 25 minutes after the hour, so we've got about a little bit more than a half hour of our program time left today. I wanted to get back to the fall elections, but most specifically to the Trump campaign and to the changes in the upper echelon of that campaign, namely the bringing on board of Stephen Bannon from Breitbart News and Kelly, I believe it's Kellyanne Kellyanne Conway as campaign manager for Donald Trump and what it means. And we talked about quite a bit about this last week. And there's no way we can recreate that whole thing. But the fact of the matter is, I'm trying to get a sense. I've got right in my hand right now about 9 different articles on this particular subject that I've extracted over the last 3 or 4 days from some of the major publications. Atlantic Magazine, Vanity Fair, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Huffington Post, The New Yorker. There was a piece written in The New Yorker by John Cassidy, who's a regular columnist there, on this particular change in with Bannon and what this issue means for the campaign, for the Republican Party, and for the future of the two-party system in America. And I thought that what I would try to do is synthesize and try to bring together and make sense out of some of this material, because it's pretty powerful. One of the issues that seems to me to be important to focus on is the story of Breitbart News and the career of Stephen Bannon, because he's going to have such a vital role in this campaign. More specifically, it seems to me the issue of concern is a concern over factors not limited or not directed specifically at the campaign. Stephen Bannon and Breitbart News both have a history. And that history suggests that what they are about is not limited to any particular election campaign. What they're talking about is building a permanent constituency, a permanent movement in this country. One of the conclusions that I think we could draw from a lot of this is that Breitbart News is probably as important as anything else in the building of the constituency that's supporting Donald Trump. It's pretty obvious that this group of millions of people who came out in the primaries to support Donald Trump didn't just suddenly emerge, fall through the rafters or whatever. It didn't just emerge. It already had to have been there. Somebody had to be talking to this group before Donald Trump came along. To the point that when Donald Trump began to campaign, he seemed to be the voice that attracted all of these people who had been primed for a campaign like this. There's no question that in its short history, Breitbart News created that constituency. It is the agent more than anything else, that has been speaking to the group of people that most avidly support Donald Trump. Poor, white, working class Americans. This is the same group that in Great Britain ended up moving the Brexit movement, Britain's vote to leave the European Union. Same people, same kinds of reasons. Breitbart News. It's been appealing to this particular group. What I was concerned about last week, and I think that was the point I was trying to make in our programs last week, is that when you realize this, when you take this into consideration, it becomes clear that this thing we call Trumpism, this outpouring of support at rallies and things for Donald Trump, is not going to disappear when the election is over. And the question is, to what extent is the permanent existence of this constituency the real goal of what this whole thing might be about? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is what Stephen Bannon is about. The question is it fair to suggest that this is what it's about to Donald Trump as well? It's hard to know the degree to which his ego, his narcissism, his need to be in front of an audience is so strong that it might be blinding him to some of these other considerations. He talks about winning. He talks about the fact that Breitbart News and Stephen Bannon are winners. They play to win. And his point is, I'm in this to win. But the realities of the situation suggest that winning is unlikely. The polls are telling us. I'm not a big fan of polls. But what the polls are telling us now is so overwhelmingly in one direction that it's really hard to deny them totally. There was an article in the Washington Post on, I believe, Saturday. It was a link that I put on our Facebook page. Because this particular article suggested, in no uncertain terms, that key elements within Hillary Clinton's campaign were already involved in planning her first term. That while they weren't openly out and out saying it, they had pretty well reached the conclusion that Hillary was going to win this election. Because the polls are suggesting is that she's well ahead in what they call the swing states, the states that Donald Trump would have to win in order to stand the chance of getting 270 electoral votes on November 8th. But the fact of the matter is, the polls are also beginning to show that Hillary is leading in states that haven't gone Democrat for a long time. Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina. And so the trend is overwhelming from all the polls. It's suggesting that this election is going to be a blowout. But the fact of the matter is there's 75 days until the election, and a lot can happen during that period. We know that. And I think most of these sources that I've looked at acknowledge that. But the fact of the matter is, what they are doing is concluding that the appointment of Bannon and Conway to run Trump's campaign and the resignation of Paul Manafort as campaign manager suggests that Trump's campaign is going to go in only one direction. And that is a direction driven by the desire to appeal to this constituency. But the experts point out that at best, maximum, this constituency only totals about 40% of the electorate. Trump can't win the election with this constituency alone. And he's polling terribly with other groups. Women, African Americans, college-educated whites. He polls 0 among African Americans. So the point is, if the campaign is going to continue to be aimed at this particular constituency, then pure arithmetic would suggest that Trump can't win. And the Clinton campaign is pretty much operating on that assumption. One of the things that I've noticed over the last 4 or 5 days is that Hillary is not nearly as visible as she was before, during, and immediately after the Democratic convention. She doesn't have to be visible. Trump's doing it all. He's basically conducting a campaign that couldn't be better if she's organized it for her. So the only conclusion that I can reach is that the significance of this particular campaign is not focused on November 8th. It's focused on the permanency of what happens after November 8th. Because there's no way that this campaign is going to end it. The idea that when November 8th comes and goes and Trump loses, he'll be gone, the movement that he led will be gone, and everything will get back to normal, is becoming increasingly unrealistic. And I think all of us need to realize that. The only question I've still got is how much of this is Donald Trump in control of. One of the postings that I put on the Facebook page over the weekend, I believe, or at least late last week, was the fact that these new appointments to run his campaign seem to suggest that the play, this particular play, has a new director and a new producer. The only difference is Donald Trump is now the star. He's the actor. He's the name. He's the face that's out there speaking to this particular group. But the degree to which he's running things, it seems to me, is somewhat questionable. That's one particular issue that I think all of us need to be quite aware of. The second one would, I think John Cassidy in New Yorker magazine labeled this, a traditional conspiracy theory. But conspiracy theory or no, the fact of the matter is, according to Cassidy, Trump himself has to realize that while he continues to talk victory, the numbers just aren't there. And so the fact is, what's driving him? Cassidy buys into the idea that what's driving Trump might be the business opportunities once the campaign's over. Namely, the opportunities to head up a media empire to compete with Fox. And the fact that he has taken on as an advisor Roger Ailes suggests that this is not as far-fetched as it appears. So, two of the things that have jumped out at me in my reading that I wanted to share with you today. First, the issue of Trump himself and whether, in fact, he's looking beyond November 8th. And if he is, it would be a media network, a huge media conglomerate that would be based principally on the support of this constituency. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that in appealing to it and building it, Breitbart News has made the point more than once that Fox News is becoming less and less of what it was at the beginning. There's less and less of Roger Ailes in Fox News than there used to be. And one of the things that Bannon himself has said, he has a daily talk show on Sirius Radio for Breitbart. I think he suspended that now that he's working in Trump's campaign. But one of the things that Bannon has basically said is that Rupert Murdoch's sons are taking on more and more of the day-to-day operations of Fox News. And there's some indication, some evidence that they believe that Fox News has become too conservative, that it's becoming too isolated, too defined, and that in order to enhance its appeal, it's going to have to kind of reach out a little bit more than it ever has done before. And so basically what Bannon and Breitbart News have suggested is that Fox News is giving up its constituency, and we're here to take it and serve it. And if you look at that constituency as the basis of a media empire, then that might be the driving force behind Donald Trump. But as Cassidy says at the end of his argument, or at the end of his article, let's remember this is only conspiracy theory. We don't know this at this point. But there's a lot of evidence to indicate that that might be true. And there's a lot of evidence from the past, from Breitbart's past, that this is really what has been driving them all along, has been driving Bannon all along. It would seem to me to make some sense that Bannon hasn't all of a sudden given up everything he dreamed about, everything he was involved in as head of Breitbart News in favor of supporting a candidate for president of the United States, and that once that was over on November 8th, he would just go back to business as usual again. It seems to be pretty logical to me that he sees long-term advantage in this support of the campaign. And there's quite a bit of evidence to indicate that that's true. I'm kind of thumbing through my source material here. One of the phrases that I put together, I thought this was really kind of a clever statement. This is in an article written in Blue Nation Review. And the comment is made, Trump is not an anomaly, he's an inevitability. In other words, once this constituency was assembled, it was just a matter of time before somebody would come along like Donald Trump and serve it and become the focus of this particular movement. One of the articles that I've got, this one is Karen Tumulty's piece in the Washington Post, dated August 17th. Last October, one publication called Stephen Bannon the most dangerous political operative in America. It was in Bloomberg. And in that Bloomberg News article, The founder of Breitbart News, Andrew Breitbart, who died in 2012, he described Bannon as the Leni Riefenstahl of the Tea Party movement. Leni Riefenstahl was a propaganda filmmaker for Hitler's Third Reich. And Bannon Breitbart described Stephen Bannon as playing that same role for the Tea Party. This is in Tumulty's article in the Washington Post. I thought it was very revealing. It says that Stephen Bannon and Andrew Breitbart first got to know each other when they met at a Beverly Hills screening in 2004 of a documentary on Ronald Reagan produced by Bannon. Bannon, during that screening, talked about meeting Breitbart. And this is a quote. "We screened the film at a festival in Beverly Hills," Bannon told Bloomberg News. "And out of the crowd comes this like bear who's squeezing me like my head's going to blow up and telling me how we've got to take back the culture," unquote. Bannon took over when Breitbart died. And it's very obvious that what drove this entire operation was much more than the election this fall of Donald Trump. Trump's campaign has played into this group, but it already existed. And one of the things I found in one of the readings, let me share this one with you. This is kind of a summary of the Trump campaign through the primaries. Some of the most noted comments and what we always thought were gaffes in Trump's primaries. And this is just incredible. This is a summary of what appealed in Donald Trump to Breitbart News. His Alex Jones-style conspiracy mongering. His meticulously crafted words of incitement and exhortations to violence. His attacks on a federal judge. His description of President Obama as a terrorist, the founder of ISIS. His birtherism. His retweets of neo-Nazis. His eliminationist language towards Hillary Clinton. Threats of violence towards Hillary Clinton. His fierce misogyny and indifference to sexual harassment. His feud with the Khan family. His ban on Muslims. His use of anti-Semitic symbols. His embracing of torture. His capriciousness about the proliferation and use of nuclear weapons. His praise for dictators, Putin. His flirtations with Putin. His welcoming of Russian cyber espionage. His undiluted xenophobia. His racist dog whistles. Look at my African American. Remember that one from one of his rallies. His infamous border wall and relentless anti-Mexican bigotry. His claims of a rigged election. His unconcealed calls for voter intimidation. His refusal to disavow ties to white supremacists. And now, his hiring of Stephen Bannon. What conclusions can one draw about the campaign, or specifically about the campaign behavior of Donald Trump? This particular article suggests that Breitbart and now the Trump campaign have become focused principally on white nationalism. I think this is very significant because on the same night that Trump announced that Bannon would be heading up his campaign, Trump gave the speech in which he made an open appeal to African Americans. And one of the themes of Trump's public appearances over the last 4 or 5 days is the extent to which he is directing the focus of his appeal to African Americans. By suggesting, as he did in one that I watched the other day, I think it was from Scranton, Pennsylvania. No, it wasn't Scranton. That was Hillary. Perhaps Charlotte. That in his appeal to African Americans, he made the comment, "You don't have any jobs. Your schools stink. You don't have any hope. What the hell do you have to lose?" The first reactions to that statement, to that speech by Trump were negative. The argument being, how does he possibly expect to appeal to African Americans saying things like that? But it didn't take long, 24 hours perhaps, for people to realize that that's just the kind of thing that might appeal to down and out African American leaders of the black community in some of the cities. The fact of the matter is that appeal to African Americans and the white nationalist leanings of Breitbart seem to be in conflict. But in one of the publications I saw, the suggestion is that Trump's move to appeal to African Americans is pretty shrewd, because it makes it easier for whites to fall into line behind Trump if they can convince themselves that he's not the racist that everybody thinks he is. So by making the appeal to African Americans, Trump is giving whites some cover for supporting him. The fact of all of this, it seems to me, the bottom line in all of this is how extremely difficult it is to predict the vote that Trump will get. It's hard to pinpoint how many of these people are going to vote for him for one or more than one of the reasons that we listed, which is a whole list. But the fact of the matter is most people, most white people, if they are planning to vote for Trump, aren't admitting it. Some are. Here in West Virginia, Trump is going to win primarily because Hillary is so hated because of her comment about coal and coal jobs and all the rest of it. If you read the full context of that speech, that's not what she was saying. But she made a mistake in expressing it that way because she gave her opponents the opportunity to take what she was saying out of context and used it against her. And they've all moved in and done that. And we're being told, as a Democratic candidate, I'm being told that to tie your campaign to Hillary Clinton is suicide. You're better off tying your campaign to the governor's race and the campaign of Jim Justice than you are to Hillary Clinton. The less you mention Hillary Clinton in West Virginia, the better off you are politically. That's the general tone of the information and the advice that we're getting. This whole thing is fascinating to me. I don't know. I'm hoping that it is for you as well. I'd like to to move into something totally different in future programs. But right now, we have reached the end of our day. It is 58 minutes after the hour, so it's time we kind of fold up here for the day. I want to thank you for being with us on this Monday, this beautiful Monday. Thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center. And equally or more important, thank you for your continued support of the Hit On Radio Network, because it's that network that enables us to be on the air. I hope you have a wonderful day, this beautiful Monday. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll be with us tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow is Tuesday. We'll be beginning our program 30 minutes later than we do today. 1:30 in the East will be our start time. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.